right thing for this facility. And so we had about, 125 rather angry people that originally arrived. And by the end of it, we had people drawing. We actually had an interesting anecdote where the health authority was so worried that this project was going to get derailed that they actually made us tape the drawings down to the table so that nobody would take them and show them to the press. And so it was sort of a very secret public event. And a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. But through the process of really caring about what people said, listening to the community, really engaging the voices of the whole community, we were able to actually create a situation where we actually got people comfortable, got people to the point where they were ready to receive this building, and that they were ready to accept that this building could actually be a good thing in the community. And you would think something like, well, baby clinics and so on would be seen to be a good thing, but it was not. It isn't always easy. And there was also this historic little brick schoolhouse, and a lot of people were afraid that we were going to tear it down. So we managed to convince our client, the health authority, that maybe we should consider keeping the brick schoolhouse, and we managed to convince the community that perhaps if we actually listened to each other and understood what each other's concerns were, that together we could create something that really made sense. So the next day in the newspaper, there was actually a piece. It's not very often architects actually get good press, but the newspaper actually said that we were able to build the trust that the health authority hadn't built. And the facility, the health center that we created, met the needs of the First Nations community, met the needs of the larger community, met the needs for green space, and of course functions as a very effective health clinic. And we did it by keeping the historic school, integrating it into the community health center, and putting, of course, the clinical spaces into the new building, and the office spaces and other kind of community spaces into the old building. And tucked in between is a circular room that you can just barely make out in this image, sort of right in the middle there, and that was the gathering space and also the prayer space. So I think that kind of illustrates or is an anecdote about the planning and how planning really connects for the larger community. And then I guess we want to talk about the third phase, so we talked about vision, we talked about planning, design and drawing. So when do we finally get to draw? When does that happen? For those of you who are students, and for those of you who've been practicing for many years, the temptation to draw always comes too early. And the temptation has to be kind of, in my view, kept sort of at bay for a little while so that we can do all this other conversation first and share stories first and eventually draw. But eventually we draw. And eventually we try to reconcile all the contradicting requirements through drawing. These are actually drawings done by one of my associates. And I particularly like this drawing because it was related to a project that we did in downtown Edmonton. It was a memorial burial ground. It was a very, very controversial situation where right in the river valley there was this historic burial ground that nobody really knew the boundaries of. There were roads over it. There was a power plant to the edge of it. And it was rather an unhappy situation where many of the Métis people, white people, Blackfoot people, Cree people, Dene people came together and said, this is no longer acceptable. We need to have some sort of a memorial on this site. And it was a remarkably interesting contradiction. And this is often what happens when we get a large basket of ideas from community engagement. What makes people most nervous is that you're going to get contradictory ideas. And then what will you do? If somebody wants it black and somebody wants it white, how will you resolve that? And this was a classic situation of that type, where we had some people who said, there cannot be a cross on this burial ground. There cannot be any Christian symbolism, because we, do not want anything that reminds us of the sort of repression in their view of the Catholic Church. And whatever we might think of the Catholic Church, there was a very strongly held point of view. On the other hand, of course, an equally strongly held point of view by other settlers who had arrived and said, no, my ancestors are buried here as well, outside of the edges of Fort Edmonton, and it must have a cross. It absolutely must have a cross, because that's how I will know that it's a burial ground for my ancestors. So how do you do both? How do you have a cross and not a cross at the same time? And so we resolved it by creating this sculptural element, which, if you read it from certain angles, kind of reads like a cross. But if you read it from other angles, it reads like a broken circle, which is sort of the story of perhaps the broken circle of the Aboriginal story. And if you read it from other angles, it just simply looks like a sculptural element. So we created this sort of three-dimensional, very light on the landscape. Oh, the other constraint was we weren't allowed to do any kind of foundations, because we didn't know where the burial was. And so everything had to be sort of surface mounted, whatever we created on this site. So we ended up creating this set of markers, essentially, on the land. And of course, the city also rerouted the road. But it was about reconciling the both and, right? To create something that was meaningful and resonant for both the people who wanted a cross and for the people who absolutely did not. And of course, we had to integrate the intentions of the Métis community. And so you see now, if you read it from the air, it also reads with the Métis symbol of infinity. And so all of these elements kind of came together. I think this is where design really, the power of design really comes in handy, and the power of the knowledge and wisdom that we have as architects, the received wisdom of architecture and design, really comes in handy to synthesize, not to impose an idea or a vision, but to actually synthesize in a kind of thoughtful and reflective way all of those ideas and visions and plans that have come from around the community. So the fourth element, so we're still working our way around the circle of our 7 teaching. The fourth element is called respect in the elders' teachings, and we kind of think of it as detailed design and construction documents, or detailing, or just thinking about detail, thinking about how things really go together, how materials go together, how ideas represent themselves in built form, and how do we illustrate those. And of course, we all like to reference the beauty of the traditional teepee form, and I don't know how many photographs I have of teepees, but from all my travels, I just have endless numbers of photographs, because I'm endlessly fascinated by how beautiful that form is against the sky, and how just simple and lovely it is, and how these teepees just kind of existed for such a very long time and somehow worked so well. So it reminds us that, it doesn't take a lot, but we do have to pay attention to the details of how it all goes together. And, detailing exists, of course, at every level, whether we're interpreting a feather falling to the ground. This was, again, that school at Driftpile. Or whether we're interpreting beadwork, in the case of the Ochese community, which is actually the only Saulteaux community in Alberta, where the elders felt very strongly that they wanted us to somehow reflect the craft and art of beadwork. Or whether we're looking at the detailing in a larger context at Athabasca University, where we designed the new academic research center, which includes the Center for World Indigenous Knowledge and Research. And in that center, of course, there's a space, and again, a circular space. And these are the wonderful things that we learn over the years. A circular space with nothing above it, right? Only sky can be above it. There's no second floor above that particular part of the building. So even though it's a 3-story building, this piece has sky above it. And so every time we come into contact with another aspect of working with First Nations, whether it's as part of a larger building or as a standalone facility, we seem to learn new stories. And the new stories keep having more layers and layers and layers, and we keep discovering. So, what about building? Well, there's great stories about building, of course, and I think any of us who've been building for a while have endless stories about building. And in that sort of circle of teachings, this teaching, the fifth one, is called truth, which I kind of like, because this really, when you build, is a bit the moment of truth, isn't it? You really come to grips with whether what the planning and the design and the detailing and all of the moving parts, does it really come together? Does it really make sense? This particular image is from the Slave Lake Government Center and Library, which, as Ralph mentioned in the introduction, is probably the only building that we will ever get to build twice in our career. We built it, it was great, everyone moved in, and then it burnt down, and we got to do it all over again. So that was a pretty neat experience, and a rare opportunity to actually explore what happens when you build not just once, but you build the same building more or less, and you build it again. And what do you do? What do you change? How do you evolve that building without really evolving it, because ultimately the insurers will only pay for the same building again, right? So that was a remarkably interesting experiment. But I want to share another story about a construction experience from a long time ago. And this one is from very far northern Saskatchewan. This is at Black Lake, Stony Rapids. So this is up on the Athabasca River. So as you see, we've traveled a little bit from coast to coast to coast. This one was neat though, because this was is actually a healthcare facility, again a hospital, and this is a replacement hospital for the hospital in Uranium City. And as you might know, Uranium City was shut down. And at that time, the Department of Health, Saskatchewan Department of Health, decided that it was time to build a new health facility. You know, that 50s building up in Uranium City was really long past its prime, and the new building needed to be located in a more central community at Stony Rapids. And we had the opportunity to consult with the community, but not just with one community, actually with 5 communities, because there are actually 5 communities that are served by this particular health facility. So we flew in, a bunch of us, and we did a bit of a traveling roadshow. We had a little plane, and we went into each of these 5 communities. We spent basically a day in each community. And in each community, we did a design workshop, and we tried to understand, you know, given the site that had been selected, what it was that we needed to do, how we would plan and design and build this facility. And it was remarkably interesting because each of these 5 communities, and this was a while back, and in the days before we had cell phones and, you know, internet and all sorts of easy access. So we went from community to community, and we were pretty sure that they hadn't talked to each other in between. But we kind of kept hearing the same thing. And what we heard was that whatever you do with the planning of this facility is all good as long as the patient rooms face the river. Not because you're going to be able to see the river, even though, as you can see from up on the roof, you can see the river, but from on the ground or from where you would have been in the patient rooms, you wouldn't be able to see the river, but you could hear the river. And hearing the river was really important to people. It was really important to everybody that we talked to in all of those 5 communities. And this particular health facility has birthing rooms and emergency rooms and elders care, and so it's a full kind of inpatient, acute care and long-term care facility. And even though it's very small, it has to accommodate all of those different uses. And so we designed it with all of the patient rooms facing towards the river so that you could hear the rapids. And in Stony Rapids, even when it's 60 below outside, you can actually hear the water running. It never freezes. So it can be 60 below outside and everything is frozen solid, but the water is running. And this is really pretty remarkable. And obviously it was very important to people. People understood that sort of viscerally, I guess, in all of these communities. Even though we talked to people who didn't live in this community, they knew that that was going to happen. Anyways, a funny construction story. So we went ahead and we designed it, and it was under construction. And one day I was out on site, and I didn't go out very often because you can imagine it's a bit of a hike. So one day I happened to be out on site, and we did have a local associate architect who was looking after the day-to-day construction administration. But I was out there, and the folks on site, the guys on site, the tradespeople, didn't really know who I was. I was just sort of minding my business, walking around. And I walked into one area, and there were these three guys sitting there and having lunch. They were having their lunch break and their lunch buckets. And the one guy said, you know, it's really cool. You can hear the river running around here from this room. That's amazing. Like, it's so neat that you can hear it. And I thought, wow, this is great that the tradesmen, like, just got it. It was just there for them. And it wasn't anything we told them to listen for. It wasn't anything we made them aware of. It was just there. And so I think those are the kind of really magical construction stories that tie back to, you know, if the planning is right and the design is right and the detail is right, then the construction continues the story of what's important in the building. And those people, because they cared about the building and because they understood that that sound was important and that was a healing sound, they did a really good job of building this building, and turned out really quite nicely. So even in the winter, like I said, that's actually a model of the building. You can sort of see how the ground falls away, and how you don't really see the river at all from the patient rooms. But all the patient rooms are strung along that north side of the building. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, because traditionally when you design healthcare facilities, you don't put all of the patient rooms facing one way. But we did, and it worked. And the south face is this double height sort of sun catcher that brings in the warmth of the sun and creates a whole bunch of other things. So some construction stories. Another little anecdote from construction. This is actually from the Peguis School, which is just up a couple of miles from here, or a couple of hours north of here. I know some of you may have been up to Peguis, but another interesting construction story was that at Peguis, basically they had a masonry trades training program going. And so we were asked to design the building so that one of the goals of the project